Thank you. Look, let me first tell you a little bit about RAKBank, actually, because it's relevant to the way I answer this question. The first thing is there really is a bit of a misconception about RAKBank. We are the National Bank of Ras Al Khaimah, obviously. But funnily enough, we, until about 3 years ago, we didn't do any business in Ras Al Khaimah, which was rather interesting when I arrived in the UAE and think, well, I'm heading this bank and we don't do business in our home emirate. So the sort of comments I may make are to an extent coloured by our experience and where we're looking to move into or change our direction somewhat in the UAE. EMIRATE'S as a bank was something that, in my mind, it's a good thing. It had been very good for the bank over a period of time, but when you look at the overall sort of balance required in a bank, you can't be so heavily skewed into one thing. So, we started about 24 months ago to spread our wings into wholesale banking. We started to spread our wings back into plain retail banking, pure retail banking as distinct from SME-led retail banking. And as part of that strategy, we moved back into Ras Al Khaimah. And, in some ways, that's given me probably a rather unique insight, I think, into the opportunities in Ras Al Khaimah and why, in fact, it is a very, very good place to invest. I think if you look at the sort of overall situation in the UAE, you do, in my mind at least, have, obviously there's the two big markets of Dubai and Abu Dhabi. Dubai clearly is the largest market, as His Highness Sheikh Saud mentioned this morning, had been very proactive in terms of developing the correct infrastructure required for companies to come and set up and grow and develop. And quite genuinely, and it's not just because I am the CEO of the National Bank of Ras Al Khaimah, I quite genuinely believe that RAK is far and away the next best in terms of providing that sort of infrastructure, that thought process. I mean, you only had to listen to His Highness this morning explain his thoughts on this to really realise that he genuinely is a visionary leader who understands what it takes to really make RAK something very good. Power and water, for example, that was one of the impediments. His Highness was very proactive in working with the teams to make sure those issues are resolved. Even things like the free trade zones. I mean, we have RAK Free Trade Zone and we had Rakia. You'll see they're both sponsors today. That is progressively being merged together under Rummy's guidance into one entity that will make sure that the future of free zones in the Emirate, again, are much more business friendly, much more focused on doing things that are more sustainable in the longer term. So I think, you have, most importantly, that sort of real drive from His Highness, from the government, from the entities in RAK to make sure that RAK becomes very much a business-friendly place. We were largely a Dubai-based bank. We do most of our business in Dubai and most of our staff are in Dubai. Some years ago, we decided to move most of our operations back to Ras Al Khaimah. Now, it wasn't because we felt that was something that His Highness would like. It was because we actually saw value in doing that. In Ras Al Khaimah, for example, we have access to a large Emirati population, and obviously being a bank we need to have certain commitment to Emiratization in our business. We have access to a population here that, to be honest, in Dubai would cost us a lot more money and is a lot more scarce. Right? So that's a very practical example of how Ras Al Khaimah's geographic location actually works in its favour. The other interesting thing that happened when we moved that business back into RAK was we also had a huge number of expat population. And I'm not, I'm using this as an example for other companies, not just for RAKBank, but, we have a large number of our expatriate population, workforce population, live in Sharjah. And, I remember when we first decided to move our back office back to RAK, and I said, we said to these guys, look, we want X hundred people to come from Dubai to RAK. They were like, oh my goodness, we've got to go there, right? Try to get them to go and work back in Dubai today would be impossible, because if you're living in Sharjah, it takes you, it might be the same distance or more, but it takes you about a quarter of the time. Everything is less expensive up here. And, so there's a natural attraction, funnily enough, because of that geographic factor.
Could you maybe touch base on what you see as the benefits of ECA financing and where they would work here in Iraq?
Yeah, sure. Happy to do that. I mean, what might make sense is for me perhaps to spend a couple of minutes talking about what ECA financing is, just because it may not be familiar to a lot of people in the audience. Export credit agencies are arms or divisions of governments across the world. And you asked about advantages, but what that helps us do, or helps any major international bank to do, is to provide a financing package that is typically very long in tenor, much longer than what the commercial banks can do on a standalone basis. Also one that is much, much cheaper in terms of overall cost of financing, and it also has a big diversification of funding sources. So it doesn't eat into bank lines, which for a lot of corporates may be quite scarce. Just by way of background, one of the first deals that I did as a relatively junior banker in my days in London was to finance the infrastructure that exists on Al Marjan Island, where we are right now. So I've got a long history in RAK. It goes back almost 10 years now. And we did manage to successfully get the Italian Export Credit Agency to support the government of Ras Al Khaimah with that particular financing package. Now, in terms of whether or not that is the right source depends on a couple of things. So, clearly with large projects or even medium-sized projects where there is an element of capital import, whether that's goods or services, doesn't matter. So, for example, the dredging of this island where we sit, or indeed any kind of dredging or software licenses or technology or process licenses, these kind of things can also be financed with export credit support. So the starting point is you've got to have a project which has that, and not all projects will have capital imports. But if you've got a project with capital imports and the underlying structure is fundamentally bankable, then I think it's certainly a very good way of bringing in sources of liquidity that perhaps would not be available on a standalone basis.
Great.
Leave out whether the export credit agency supported or not, or whether they're international banks or domestic banks. The fundamental issue is that, is the project bankable? Are you coming to banks with a proposition that makes sense for us as lenders? Remember that as banks, all of us face this issue. We share in the downside when things go wrong, but when things go really well, we basically get our money back and perhaps a small bit of interest on top of that. So the way those incentives are aligned, clearly banks are very much driven to look very carefully at risk and make sure that they are actually supporting the right projects in terms of ensuring that those projects have the ability to weather storms and pay back the amount that they've borrowed. Banks these days, and I'm making a sweeping generalization here, but for the most part, in my opinion, are relationship driven. So, the first starting point in terms of a success story is making sure that the promoters or the people who are putting up that bit of project have a relationship with their bank. So I would always encourage people to start with their existing relationship banks before venturing out to new relationships while putting up a large project. A soul-searching exercise and a consultation exercise is probably extremely important. But the success stories that you asked for, they are everywhere. Certainly in terms of the export credit world, we've had a massive amount of success in not only in the UAE but in the broader MENA region. So I mentioned obviously the financing we did with Ras Al Khaimah a decade ago, but there've been large financings in recent times with DEWA, for example, Dubai Electricity and Water Authority. There have been large successful financings with a lot of real estate developers, particularly in Dubai and to some extent in Abu Dhabi. This is driven by them using UK-based building contractors to put up these hotels or theme parks or other large projects. Certainly, export credits have been used in land reclamation projects, such as the one we're on right now, but also many of the recent developments in Dubai. Back to core infrastructure. If you look at Egypt, for example, they've raised something like 4.6 billion euros of export credit financing for power generation projects, which should hopefully completely take away Egypt's power shortages. shortages. So, I think it's been used successfully across a variety of countries, across a variety of sectors, and there's no shortage of success stories, I think, in this space in recent times.
Great. So I guess what is coming out from that, Ras Al Khaimah and the role of the government. Peter, how do you see the role of the government playing here, and what should they do or not do to make projects successful in Ras Al Khaimah?
Yeah, look, I think, my view may be a little bit different on this. I take the view very much that government's role, and I guess it's also because I have spent so much time with the government, I think they very much view their role as providing a platform, providing the necessary infrastructure, providing the necessary regulatory framework. I mean, His Highness mentioned this morning, for example, the thing they've just done with DIFC are not overly relevant to some businesses, but for small business owners is actually a very relevant point. Businesses, I'm not sure in the longer term that is a good thing. I think, and as I said, I think RAK has developed a certain model. I think it's working very, very well, and I don't think there's a need for them to become more actively involved in businesses. In fact, if you look at the businesses they have been involved in over the years, progressively the government has tended to reduce its stakes in those businesses and let them run on their own. Now, perhaps that may have helped them get off the ground in the first place, but going forward, I don't believe that really is the model that the government wants to adopt.
And I guess that makes sense when we talk about, equity investments and the, providing guarantees, for example, to guarantee certain risks that the government is best placed to take, right? Construction risk on certain things, ramp-up risk on other projects, to help bridge the phase between getting a project off the ground and getting it at an operational stage and getting lenders comfortable with that period. Is that something that you see being helpful here, and what's your view on that?
To be very frank, no. I see it's not just a trend, I'm not sure of your experience, but a trend not just in RAK, but particularly in Dubai. We're seeing it increasingly where there is less likely to be guarantees provided by government, even if it means that the pricing on that particular deal has to be higher. And I think from a, whether it be a situation with the World Bank or whatever it may be, I think it makes perfect sense, again, for the government to remove itself from that and, let private enterprise stand on its own 2 feet and just support projects in the manner that I mentioned, rather than necessarily, because whether it's direct financial support or it's a guarantee, at the end of the day, there's a similar result, right, if something goes wrong.
Absolutely. Manaf, please can you add?
Yeah, it has a very robust revenue model. It doesn't rely on a government guarantee, and it sells power commercially to the market. And it's a very profitable model in that sense. To buy the power, but there is a private entity that will build and finance the power plant. So there is someone out there who plans the project, takes the equity risk on a project, and then enjoys the upside if things work out better than planned. The important thing over there is that there is still a very, very critical role for the government. One is to create a regulatory environment where people are prepared to invest, so providing them with that certainty that that contracts will be upheld, that if they wanted to enforce certain obligations that they could, providing them with the infrastructure perhaps that is required to do whatever business is in question. But also, when you talk about guarantees, sometimes the backstop for some of these payment obligations, which may be very substantial and which may go on for a very long time, need to come from the government. So, for example, if you're financing a toll road and lenders are in fact taking risk that people will use that toll road, that is something that in certain situations is bankable. What you do need from the government is an assurance, for example, that they will not interfere in the toll rates, or that they won't unilaterally reduce them, or they won't suddenly put up another road right next door which will take away the traffic. So I think there's a lot of judgment to be used, but there is a role for for the government, certainly as a regulator, certainly in terms of providing a framework, and in many cases for being a backstop in terms of ensuring that money is available to pay, particularly for large infrastructure projects?
I would tend to agree with this. I mean, that's my experience, at least in terms of what I've seen on essentially infrastructure.